All right, here we are today with another great episode of Ditch Digger CEO with my host, my producer Chris, and I'm the host Gary Rabine, and we've got a great entrepreneur on with us today that's is in an exciting industry that we're going to share with you. We're going to share his success. But Bruce Ballengee, welcome to Ditch Digger CEO with Chris and I.
Well, thank you both, and thanks audience for taking the time to listen today.
They're going to learn a lot today. Like I think I always learn a lot. You know, I'm a guy that's constantly learning because I believe that it's all about living through other people's experiences as much as you can, because we learn a lot from our mistakes. But boy, it's a lot less expensive when we can learn from other people's mistakes, right, Bruce?
That's correct.
So, Bruce, we'd love to go into maybe a little bit about your business first, just about kind of summary of what you guys do today, or this great company that you've started. And then kind of go into your upbringing. What kind of brought you into being an entrepreneur and into technology and all the things you do today. And if we can start with that.
Okay, so Pariveda Solutions, we've been around just over 20 years. We're in year 21.
So do me a favor, spell that out clearly.
So Pariveda is P as in Peter, A-R-I, V as in Victor, E-D-A. Solutions. I mispronounce it. It's really Pariveda in Sanskrit, and it means reaching for complete knowledge. So it's and we have no operations in India. we're strictly North America. So
that's I love that, reaching for complete knowledge.
Yeah, that's the name I chose for us when 21 years ago. So we are an IT/management consulting company. We're in 12 major metros in North America, 11 in the US, and then Toronto in Canada. And I like to describe us as we help our clients solve complex, ambiguous problems. That's our goal. That's what we really strive for. And that's how I think that it is how folks largely identify us, along with, wow, you're really easy to work with. Like you're very straightforward and very transparent and all that kind of good stuff. That is just about having lifetime relationships with clients.
And Bruce, you say this, and I love it because I hear this so often from successful entrepreneurs. I believe it. The most successful entrepreneurs come from a place, a servant heart. And I feel like that statement you just made, right? Helping clients solve complex problems. I mean, that's what we all. If you're successful, you probably done that. And you probably focused on that intently, so that your customers see you as an amazing value outside the competitive price that your company might be, right?
And that's right. And it's tough out there. There's a lot of lower cost per hour options.
Yeah. There's lots of. It's a commoditized world if you let it be. But what you just said, we were friends with the guy that started Waze that Google Maps bought, and Uri was on our podcast, I don't know, 10, 12 podcasts ago, and he wrote a book recently, and that's basically exactly the title of the book, right? It was fall in love with the problem. Right. And that's all he does as he builds business after business is he falls in love with a problem that he knows is a big problem for big market cap businesses. And he goes after it. Right. So what you just said, I mean, it's just the first thing you said, but it's funny because I see this over and over again. The most successful people do a great job. Say it the way you said it, the way he says it, the way we say it. But if you just fall in love with a problem that's many people have, and you monetize that, and good things work out.
Yeah. And we don't have time for it. There's lots of good Pariveda stories about that. I have lots of great stories early in my career. Approaching the world that way with clients.
Well, we'll go back to that, because I would love to hear one great story that really worked out well because of that mindset. But let's go back.
So that's basically Pariveda. So now if we go back to the beginning, so I grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas. It used to be the sparkling city by the sea. I don't think that's our, handle anymore in the modern era. But, I grew up like 4 to 5 blocks away from a bay where, we could throw our fishing rods and nets and our baskets on our bikes and, take the mile or, bike ride down to a place where you could fish legally, without having to pay money to go out on a real pier or anything like that. So, that was kind of Corpus, a fairly sleepy town. Almost all my friends left for bigger cities. We went to college, we got degrees, and we never came back because there just weren't, just wasn't that many jobs there. So, which probably had something to do with entrepreneurism. To kind of carry that along, I managed to get in to college with really good grades, and that made it possible to actually go to a private university with all the scholarship money. To me, that is a part, and it's not as easy as it used to be to get scholarship money. Now they want you to borrow mostly, but that was a huge part of launching my career, was being able to basically go to college on very little money, because almost all of it was coming from scholarships.
What school was that?
So I went to Baylor University.
Great school
in Waco. So I got there, and I knew, the only thing I knew is I didn't want to be what either of my parents were. So my mom was a biology undergrad and an entomology master's, which, in that time, maybe even today, it's really tough for a woman to be an entomologist. I mean, it's just not done still. It's a bastion of kind of the male world, dealing with pesticides and bugs. And then my dad was a chemical engineer to start out, and he didn't like that. And so all I knew is I didn't want to be what either of them had started out to be. And I was very engaged with some upperclassmen through some of the work that I was doing on campus. And they were like, "Oh, you should go to the business school. You should study economics, but you need to get a finance major as well, because there's jobs. There's jobs with a finance degree versus economics. You kind of wind up, leaning into academia." And so I took their advice, and I graduated, with a BBA in finance and economics. And over the time, kind of picking out like, well, what are you going to do with that? And I decided I wanted to be a commercial banker, and that ultimately I wanted to own a bank. And so it may be still as cut and dried as was back then. It was, okay, so if you want to own a bank, then you need to grow up through the ranks. You need like a bank president. If you want to be a bank president, you're going to have to be a loan officer. If you're going to be a loan officer, you got to be a credit analyst. If you're going to be a credit analyst, you need an MBA. And I was like, okay, I can do the math. And so I didn't interview as an undergrad for any jobs. I applied to 2 MBA programs, booths in Chicago and the University of Texas, got accepted to both, had saved enough money to pay for UT, and went into debt to my eyeballs going to Chicago booth. Now, the math kind of worked, because, it's a finance career, right? It's going to be all right. You can pay the loan off, which it certainly worked out that way. And so I got a specialization in finance. Now
you went to Chicago booth?
Yeah. Before it was Booth, it used to be the GSB, the Graduate School of Business. But one of my classmates, Booth, I don't know how much he gave him, but he gave him enough to get the naming rights. I mean, literally one of my classmates while I was those years.
That was Booth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
the young Booth, the son. Yeah. The son of the founder of multidimensional finance. And at any rate, you could get him on, and I'm sure he has a fabulous story, but in a different podcast. And so but here's the thing. So I applied to banks in Texas. Because I had a girlfriend who was like, "If you want to marry me, you're going to need to get a job in Texas." I'm like, well, okay. I mean, chill, that's okay. But I had a heuristic on campus, because very few companies actually came to campus to interview for jobs that had openings in Texas. One of them happened to be Accenture, really late at the end, in the middle of the last quarter. And I was like, okay, what am I going to do? I have all these bank offers. I got to choose between them over the next month or so. They're all coming due. and I'm going to do my thing, right? I'm going to be a credit analyst so I can be a loan officer, yada, 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 and wind up starting a bank in a small rural town in Texas and be basically like the guy in It's a Wonderful Life without ever, you know how that one starts out with he's contemplating suicide. No, not going to be none of that, right? It's just going to be, we're just going to be like that in a good way. And, you know, we're going to be the center of, we're going to be the bulwark of finance in that town, you know, service, right? Just, you know, service. And so here's Accenture. And I was like, you know, they have jobs in Texas. I could get a second interview in Texas. They would fly me to a city in Texas and I would be within 2 or 3 hours of my girlfriend. So I'll do the interview. And they, you know, they were impressed, I guess, that, so you need a second interview. And where do you want to go? And I listed off a bunch of cities that were, you know, proximate to Waco. She was still an undergraduate at Baylor. And they just said, well, you only want to go to Dallas. And I was like, okay, it's only 98 miles. Waco. Can I do it on a Friday? Was my next question. Oh, of course you can do it on a Friday. And I'm like, this is great. And so I went. And over the course of a day and a half, they convinced me that I should pursue a career in information technology consulting, that they would teach me everything I need to know about computers and all that sort of stuff. And here was the, you know, the guaranteed out of the back end was, if you don't like it, right, in the first year or two, we will help you get a job in banking. So it's like, we have a no risk proposition for you. Well, I never left. I've had banking clients, but I never went to work at a bank. I mean, that I spent my first 10 years there, and then to, you know, various places in between, consulting companies, running IT departments, various things. And then
so that was like early 80s, is that right?
81. Started working in 81.
Same time I started my business and graduated high school for me. Yeah. Okay. So with that, name a couple of things that were like technologically amazing then that you looked at and said, oh my God, this is going to be the future. Just that you back at.
Well, the PC had already been announced as the future, and I think in 80, or before I started in the summer of 81. That was interesting. But the biggest thing technologically was, this was about 4 years in, is when the client server architectures, you know, the PC tied in with the mainframe, really started to take off. And I thought it was going to change the world. And I guess it did to some extent. And I thought it was going to kill off the mainframe, which it never has. You know? So that was the first one. And I very much plunged into it way beyond what Accenture was doing at the time. You know, got way deep into it, learning it and understanding everything and that I could about it. And that became an area of expertise for me inside Accenture, as one of the people that was really, you know, up on the leading edge, which was interesting over time, because after about 3 years, I said, this thing's really taken off and I can't keep on top of it anymore. It's gotten so big and so expanded. I can't know everything about it, like pretend I'm a Renaissance person anymore. It's gotten so big. And so I need to move on to, you know, to other things, which I did, which is, you know, maybe another, I don't know if that's a lesson or not, but if it is, I'll tell you what I decided. I said, you know, so this technology changes so fast. And what doesn't change as fast are the processes by which we develop software or, you know, or any project process. That is a much slower rate of change. And in fact, for software, it's about 1% per annum CAGR, right? So it doesn't change very fast. So I got into software methodologies heavily, and most of that's still good. You know, that was like 30 years ago. It's mostly still relevant and good. Obviously, there's some changes and all, but they're largely refinements on, you know, what's been happening before, because the CAGR is 1%.
You're saying basically, Bruce, the processes to develop technology really doesn't change. I mean, new technology comes across, but the process to develop it and to build it within your business doesn't really change.
That's right. And people would say, well, you know, Bruce, you're out of date because AI, you know, generative AI is going to change that. And I said, well, have you really gotten into it? It's going to make, I think it's going to beautifully drive a 1% CAGR for the next decade or so. But it was so interesting is that when was this? This was probably the late 80s. I got through Accenture. I got connected with some professors at various universities that were doing special work for NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And they had the holy grail of, we're going to generate code. Have you heard that a lot in the last year about Gen AI? We're going to generate code. And I just looked at them and said, gentlemen, I don't think that that's ever really going to be possible to really generate, high quality code. And they were like, well, it's going to take a long time, but it's right. It's like, it's aspirational, right? We got to get there. And that was a long time ago. That was, like I said, late 80s, mid to late 80s. And so now we're talking about it again, and it'll be better this time. We'll generate some code, maybe 20%, versus none. But that was, so maybe there's a lesson there, or maybe not. I think time will tell. See if.
Well, so I love it as you talk, if you could kind of go over the one or two biggest things in each decade. Okay. So we go to the 90s now, talk about where you're at and what roles and responsibilities took on, and then kind of the technology you saw again that changed the 90s or into the 2000s.
Yeah. No. Well, now I'd have to be careful here about, when did the cellular phones start to really take off? Like my wife was a partner in a law firm. She had a Motorola brick phone in her car. Very, very expensive, but she was an expensive attorney. And so it was very, billable minutes and all that kind of stuff. And, would I have a phone? No way. Right. But
Bruce, I remember those phones. My first brick, I had the battery pack and the battery at the time was in the trunk. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Pull the thing out and strap it over my shoulder, charged in the trunk, but then you had to pull this whole thing that's 20, 30 pounds, whatever it was.
Oh, yours was more portable. Okay. But yeah, her battery was in the trunk or underneath her passenger seat.
And you thought you're pretty cool when you can talk to somebody about 10% of the time, in your car or outside your car, right?
Well, it was huge.
You got.
It was huge. And it was the beginning, it was the beginning of something. Another interesting one when this was going on it's so funny. This was going on at Accenture, and I make a joke about myself today. And so when I was at Accenture, I made a huge investment in voicemail and, voice technology, front end stuff. And they wouldn't give PCs at the time. They wouldn't give PCs to anybody unless it's just for project work, just build out. And the admins didn't have it, the partners didn't have it. And so there was this over reliance on voicemail, which was amazing. You get these 20-minute, messages right to the office for something or other. And you have to listen to 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And I was like, as a manager at the time, right? And I was like, man, this is so dated. Email is the future.
Yeah.
Email is the future, and you think about its impact in industries like direct mail, which were going from postal to email, and it just dramatically impacted the cost structure. And so I'm, even today, I'm still in email. I'm super efficient on email, and most of my relationships are outside our firm. Well, most of our folks, they're very modern, so they're into Slack. And I'm very careful. I'm like, I do not use Slack, and Bruce does not use Slack. So if you want to contact him, you can call him, you can voicemail, you can see him face to face, you can send him a text, but he will not respond to Slack. And I tell folks, as soon as we can open up Slack to everybody outside Pariveda, and they can all Slack with me, I'm okay, but I'm not going to add a sixth or seventh communications channel. I'm just already full. So I'm basically like one of those Accenture partners years ago, right? It's like, I'm not going to do email. I've already got all these channels. I can't add another one at this age. So fie on myself, right? But at any rate, so that's the 90s and the 2000s. As far as that,
so 90s was, like you're saying, the what do you call it, voice over IP? What do you call that stuff?
voice over IP and just flat out IP. I mean, the whole World Wide Web, internet. So I can remember in 91, I had a department, an IT department at US Sprint, and that several people in my department came and said, Bruce, can you send in a request so that we can get, ARPANET accounts and get on Usenet? And I'm like, sure. And, so I sent it off to Big Sprint in Kansas City, and they come back and say, why in the world does an IT department want that? That's just for the network engineers.
Yeah.
I explained anyway. And, we got the accounts. I can't imagine it costs more than $5 or $6 a year for a person or something like that. It's essentially free then. And, that was just the beginning of that stuff taking off. So by the mid 90s, that was huge. I remember trying to help a very large public utility embrace the internet. It was early days, and their employees were way ahead of them versus the company. So they're rolling out and all that. And we were doing work on a lot of really cool stuff, very leading edge work, complicated, ambiguous problems. And one particular day, their internet was just incredibly slow. And the CIO, she asked me, said, well, what do you think's going on? And I said, everybody's downloading the trailer to the next Star Wars, right? Because that was where the second, the first one in the second set came out. Oh, I mean, it is profound, right? And now I got social media stuff. I mean, it's
now, and that was the late 90s, probably, huh?
Yeah. So that was late 90s. Yep. And then in the 2000s, I think, it's been Gen AI. Well, I mean, the whole pandemic response and moving towards more remote and remote collaboration, much accelerated. All these things got accelerated by the pandemic, but you had social media really taken off with its implications for B2B, B2B and B2B marketing, and a whole new generation coming up of millennials that.
But let's not skip the 2000s. So okay, with 2000, 2010, we had like this. Like I'm guessing, like the smartphones came out early. Is it early 2000s? Out?
Yeah. And yes, they started to have that. Yep.
I mean, really, Apple was, was a good company before that, but became amazing after that, right?
They did, because they made software available, right? The software. I mean, the idea of course, music at first, but then it was like, and we'll create a very controlled space for applications, and that's what really led them to their dominance over, the Motorola's and I can't think of the Finnish company. It wasn't Ericsson. It's the other handset company.
Yeah. So like you're saying, early game was iPods, the iPod, right? Then the iPhone, right? Then Apple took over the market after Motorola. Kind of before that was a big player. Right. They kind of folded almost.
Yeah, because they didn't have the applications. They didn't have the high value added activities,
right?
We support capabilities
and then 2010s to 2020, let's say, early 2010s, let's say, was there anything that really was game changing in a big way that people would know about compared to then the COVID issue and things that happened then?
Well, I would say the current architecture, if you will, maybe it's not the right word, the current iteration of artificial intelligence was well underway, but it didn't really take off or hit the public's imagination really until the 2020s. But it was very much starting in the 2010s. It was so interesting. I was doing work on government for trying to win government contracts, and a lot of that technology was around in the 90s.
So all this stuff with artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's been going on for a long time. 2010 to 2020, where you as a tech mind knew it was knew what's going on, but then 2020 COVID and on now really in the mainstream, right? With Chat GPT,
right? GTP,
whatever you call that, and everything else going on, right?
Yeah. With Open API being probably the leading one. Some different vendors, maybe Google might be upset with that.
What do you call it? Open what?
Open API is the name of the company that's the company that created ChatGPT. Microsoft has a big stake in them and is their sugar daddy, but
Yeah. Okay. So and what do you see as something, that's going to really be developed in the rest of the 2020 and into 2030? You kind of feel it's kind of that machine learning and artificial intelligence really becoming more and more mainstream, so it's accessible to like everybody. Is that what you're thinking?
I think definitely that there's a lot of work to do there. That is doable. It's very much, for example, today it's very much an English-based technology. It feeds on data. It feeds on mostly text, right, and imaging, but most of that's English. And so you've got 600 languages in the world, and some of them have hundreds of millions of speakers, right, and users. And so there's a vast amount of stuff to tie in there, and people are working on it, right? Some of them it's government driven, some of it's privately driven, but there's a ton of work to do there. And of course, there's a lot yet to learn.
So basically right now, like you said, most of it's in English, and you see it over the next 10 years growing into every single language, right?
Right. And that much more information. So that much better understanding of the past. Now, I don't think there's going to be a naked singularity where, suddenly we have a sentient artificial intelligence. I don't buy that, but I could be wrong. I've given several examples of where I've been wrong.
Yeah.
I expect that trend to continue in the future.
Well, I think if we're always exposing ourselves to innovation, we're going to be wrong a lot. There's going to be things that just don't happen that we or others think are going to happen, and that's okay. Yeah. I think it's part of our development in innovation and technology in our own personal path, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you think of your business now, tell us about when Pariveda started, and then how it's grown and why it's grown.
Yeah. Well, so I had started, in between there, I had started my own company and then merged it with another. It was a small company, but larger than mine. And then about 3 years later, we sold that to yet another company. And that had, that was the exit. And, but there were strings attached. Some of them unreasonable, some of them reasonable. But basically, you could either quit or stay for another 2 years, minimum. And I decided it was a tough time. This was 2001, and the tech wreck or the .com bomb. However, different people have different terms for it. But it was in the middle of that, and that's why we were acquired. We were acquired because we were still making money, and for one quarter, our little company would give them a positive net income. The bigger consulting firm, and that was a board mandate. So that's why we were acquired. It was fascinating, right? And so it was tough. It's a tough world.
So was that right around 2000 then, or after 2000?
Right after 2000. Right after the 2000, and that spin just dried up, and then of course the .coms started folding, and that really seriously impacted our industry. And so the 2 years, so that was 2001 that we closed, right at the beginning of the bad part of this downturn. And then in 2003, it was hitting bottom. So it hit bottom in the fall of 2003. And that's when we started. I basically had told people at the beginning of that year, I'd met now a lot of people in this larger company, and I had stayed to help our folks, right? They didn't have big payouts like I did. They needed to keep their jobs, and it was a tough market. It's not a market where you could just go find a job someplace else, right? You needed to hold on what you had as best you could. And I just kind of spread out and started helping not just, the people that came with us, but people who come through other acquisitions as well. And here it is, it's coming up 2003. And I'm like, my 2 years is going to be up, and I can walk out of here a free person and all that sort of stuff. It was, I called it it wasn't golden handcuffs. They were handcuffs of steel. It's a very interesting. It was a very interesting transaction, but which would be a different subject for a different day with a very adult audience. I'd say, it's not G-rated stuff, and as you can imagine, and then so I decided, I didn't need to work anymore, and I decided, okay, I'm going to go get a doctorate in management information systems because a finance person's not going to be able to get a computer science PhD very easily, but I can get one in MIS in a business school. And so I made those arrangements. The chairman of the department was going to be my principal investigator, and he'd worked with, people like me that had been in the workforce and all that sort of stuff. And it was going to be great. And so I told folks at this company, I said, look, I want you to know I'm leaving in the fall, with the start of that semester. And they said, hey, don't do that. We want you to start a company so that we can come work with you. And I was like, man, I'm really looking forward to this thing about being an academic and teaching young people, and just having a blast. And I don't have to worry about getting tenured or not. I don't need to work. And although obviously, you want to keep your job, but, and so, okay, I'll tell you, because I had ideas for businesses. And so I told them my ideas, and they said, well, that sounds really hard. And I said, well, starting any business is hard. And then they said, well, no one's ever done that before. And I said, well, why would you want to do something that somebody's already done? It's just not that interesting. And they said, this is like 10 or 15 people in a conference room at the consulting company, and they just looked at me, and one of them, I don't know who it was, but one of them said, Bruce, you're not listening to us. All we know how to do is to do consulting. You need to start another consulting company. And I literally, it's like being in an auto accident where you think time has slowed down and you're just processing everything. And I'm standing in front of the room and I'm looking up at the ceiling and I'm thinking about, am I going to do this? Am I going to do this? Do another consulting company? I thought I will, because they really, really need me to do this. And so I did, but I said, but it's going to be different and it's going to be interesting.
And this is 2003 or 4? Or
2003. So this is 2003. This is like the summer.
So you abandoned the thought or your dream of doing something that was there's nothing nobody's ever done before, to just going back and being a better consulting company than you'd seen before.
That's right. Being a different and interesting consulting company than any other consulting company, which we are. There's no question about that. But it's not crazy different. Okay,
so tell me the differentiation that you believe back then you could create, and what you and your team have created over the past 20 years.
So here's the basic thing. So remember, it is the tech wreck. IT unemployment is as high as it's ever been, ever, even since, right? Even since then, right? It's never been that low before. And I said, look, here's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem in the world is it's not that there's a scarcity of work out there. There's not a scarcity of, I should say, demand, because the number of problems is infinite, right? We are never, knock on wood, going to run out of problems in the world. That would be some kind of sci-fi transcendence thing, go to energy state. And there's probably problems there too, right? That would just be very different. And so I said, but most consulting firms are worrying about, the 20 to 30% of stuff that's the stuff in the iceberg that's sticking up above the waterline. And there's 70, maybe 80% of the work that's below the waterline. That's like unknown, unmet kinds of problems. There's tons out there. And when things get bad, like there's a recession, there's more problems than there were when times were good. What the problem is that the customer doesn't know what their problem is, or doesn't know, that's a lot of it, right? Or doesn't know how to even approach dealing with that problem, or doesn't prioritize it very high. There's various things that make up that 70%. And so if we had the talent to explain that, to identify that and explain it and sell it, right? And then be able to successfully deliver a successful outcome on that, the world would be our oyster. So there's a shortage. the shortage is of talented people who can do that. They're scarce as hen's teeth. And so we're going to establish a firm.
They're scarce as what?
Hen's teeth. That's an old Southern phrase. I show my Texas heritage. Rare. How about we just go rare?
I like it. Okay. So you're thinking. So when you think about this, Bruce, I mean, you're saying, when you understand technology well, and you understand the problem that a customer is going through, there's so many avenues with technology to solve many of the problems, right? So you guys knew that hey, that when this tech crunch time, there's no shortage of problems. There's more problems than ever before. Maybe just the name, the connotation of technology scared people away because it was technology companies that were a big part of that burst, right? The bubble burst. But you knew that in consulting, there's just more opportunity. You said find the right people to be able to solve problems for customers.
That's right. And develop, right? And it's a whole, the whole business model is about, recruiting and developing.
Okay, so where did you look for these people that are scarce as hen's teeth?
Yeah, well, you have to grow them, because the best place to start with is, they're not tabula rasa, they have blank minds, but college kids are the best. They haven't been messed up by working at other companies. And so, of course, you can't start out that way. You can't start out with, okay, just go get a bunch of college kids and throw them in a room, right? You got to find people of like-mindedness and capability, but then and that's your core. And then we started. So our whole thing was, okay, we're going to start this, and as quickly as we can, we're going to be on campus recruiting, and we are going to very much be focused on developing those young people into eventually, vice presidents who are these kind of world beaters. And we have done that. I mean, we have college students that, have made it all the way to vice president / partner, depending on, we're in a corp, so it's vice president, but other firms might be partners in a partnership. So we've done that. And there's very few firms that have done that. Yeah.
So Bruce said, cool. You're kind of on the mindset that you want to go and teach people. You want to use your wisdom to go back to school and get that PhD and teach people.
Right.
And you wouldn't have made a lot of money. You wouldn't have created much wealth, but you would have been, you knew that, mentoring, you'd get a lot out of that personally.
That's right. It would have been a blast.
And instead, right, you get asked by your team to come back and start this thing, and you become, more than a normal PhD, a PhD that's teaching and instructing and growing an enterprise value that you all participate in, which is pretty cool.
And so you'd mentioned before about, hey, what's the kind of problem? So this is a problem that's occurred a couple of times, maybe more than that, in my career. This particular story, this would be when I was back at Accenture. So I'm just a new manager, as a matter of fact, like 4 years into my career, and working for a pipeline company, a liquids pipeline. So that means they pump oil and kerosene and diesel fuel and whatever, not just gas, but regular gas for cars up and down the country in their pipeline. And it's very complex. There's a lot of challenges and issues. Well, one of the problems they had was their forecast accuracy for demand at the terminals, the tank farms where trucks come and and pick up stuff and all that. That was their success for 30 years was 50% forecast accuracy. And they had, they'd dorked with it. They tried stuff for decades and decades, and they'd settled in, and they really hadn't changed a thing in 30 years because they couldn't make it any better. And that was kind of a side aspect of this project that we had. And there was an Israeli professor, former, IDF fighter pilot, who they were subcontracting to solve this problem. And he came to Oklahoma. This was up in Oklahoma. He came one time, and I asked him. I said, because he told me a little bit what he was doing. I said, so you do know? Well, it's a stupid question because it's obvious, right? So you do know that this problem, kind of as you framed it, is a transportation problem, and so it can't, there's no optimal solution to be found, even using all the computing power in the world. It's just one of these classic, non-solvable problem as framed. He says, I know, but what if I could solve it? Okay. It was such a downer for me. I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's essentially taking their money, right? And I didn't talk to anybody else at Accenture about it. I just said, I need to walk into the client's office and I need to have a conversation with him about this. I'm not going to bring up any of that. Right? I'm not that stupid. Although someone say, Bruce, you're still just as bad as you've always been. But I walked in there, it's this guy, so 4 years out of my, grad school, and to these pretty senior people, a vice president and a director. And I said, hey, tell me about your forecasting. Yeah, it's 50%. I said, well, can I ask you some questions? I said, sure. I said, you're only open Monday through Friday. You're not open on Saturday and Sunday. And he said, oh, you mean the zero sales those days? Oh, we average that out. So we're just doing we're just taking the 5 days. So that's not a problem, right? We've solved for that. You don't need to worry about that. And I said, well, let me just ask you a few more questions along those lines. Right? So the next thing I said, do your customers know that you're closed on Saturday and Sunday? And they said, well, of course they do. And I kind of go like, I thought so, without saying that, but I said, yeah, I thought so, but it's always gotta lead, you gotta take people gently, right? And then so I said, so what do you think? Do you think on Friday that the more trucks come and pick up more fuel because they know for the weekend with motorists or that they can't come back to the terminal and get more gas if they run out? And do you think on Mondays, especially after a busy weekend, that there aren't more trucks coming on Mondays to pick up, gas and stuff? He said, well, we hadn't thought about that. So this was Friday afternoon. It's like I got an hour to get to the airplane. It's a little town. It's not a big deal. So I said, can you send me all your data, right? For all the terminal sales of, all your fuel, different grades, email it to me and I'll work on it this weekend. And, I'm coming back Monday, right? Friday, come back Monday. And they sent me that. So it was a few thousand rows of data. Today, we wouldn't call that big data. You wouldn't even call it big data back then, but really, essentially, it was a big data set. Yeah. Relatively speaking. I mean, this was the early 90s. And, what was that? It was the 80s. I'm sorry. It was the mid 80s. And, so I took it home on my PC, and after the football games, I just said, okay, I'm just going to take a hypothesis and see if this doesn't work, because, I could spend months trying different kinds of things, but I'm not going to be an innocent here. I'm going to be biased about, I think that there's some seasonality in this, and that, there's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday seasons, right? There's 5 seasons. And I'm just going to say, you know what? I'm going to do, how well do the last 4 Fridays predict the next Friday, the 5th Friday, and the Mondays and that and Tuesdays, and just see. So nothing about holidays, nothing, right? Just really simple. And it was 85% accurate. So I come back in on Monday, show them. They're amazed. They tell Accenture, hey, we don't need that Israeli prof anymore. And of course, I got in big trouble with the partner.
Figured out that was a big awakening for that customer.
Oh, yeah. And it made a huge difference. Just right there. Now I said, we can put somebody on this thing and we get it to better, right? 85 is just like tables, right? But
that's correct. So that was part of one of your first lessons of solving problems, and your business today. You've got about 1,000 people on your team now. Is that right?
Oh no, we're 650-ish, something like that.
Oh, 650, okay, about 650 people on your team.
Yeah.
And how many of those are really focused on solving customers' problems?
Well, I like to say everybody, because everybody has a customer. So some of our folks are, have consultants as their internal customers. Everybody has a customer. One of our old rules.
So you hear stories on a daily basis of your team solving major issues.
That's right. That's right. And one of our old, I don't think we use it as much anymore, but one of our old things at Pariveda was everybody sells. I mean, we had, our controller sold, brought in client work. One time we had a college hire, and the first week they were here, they sold work, right? Yeah.
Sure. So tell us about the 20 years now.
Yeah.
The growth that you've seen, Bruce, in 20 years from that first. How many employees did you start with?
Well, we started with two of us with a plan to, as we sold work, we would get more. So it's another interesting story and lesson. So when I started my first company, I had 3 former bosses that would call me and say, Bruce, I want you to come work for me. And I would say, hey, no, my wife's a partner in a law firm. I'm not going to move to out of state. She makes more money than I do, but I can come consult for you. And eventually all 3 of them were like, okay, all right, come consult to us. And so I launched my own company. And as I like to say, I was called, right? That was called by potential clients and said, I want to give you work, which is a fabulous way to start a business. I mean,
awesome way.
Couldn't ask for an easier start.
Now, you should interview with about 100 companies at that point, and you'd had 80 of them wanting you to consult to them.
That's right. And if you think about my earlier story about starting Pariveda, it's like I was definitely being called. Right? I was being called to start that company, but very different. So when we're starting out, there's a string of people that say, hey, I'm pretty entrepreneurial. I can take the risk. As soon as you get some work and you feel like you can hire somebody, I'm ready to come on as the next one, right? And help sell and all that sort of stuff.
Nice.
Okay. And then you got people that are like, hey, I'm not that savvy, but I really want to do it. And, as soon as you there, right, all that sort of stuff. So we put up a 5-page website. I mean, a 1-page website with our 5 core values. And we, as I like to describe it, we went and begged. So we went to everybody that we'd worked for before that wasn't in the realm of the non-competes, non-solicit kind of restrictions that we had, which was a lot. And we'd say, hey, John, hey, Paul, hey, Susan, whoever it was, hey, you remember when the 2 of us, right? Either was telling a story, did that great work for you, whatever, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago. Well, we got our own company now, and we're ready to do it again. It was not a good time. I mean, this was the bottom of the tech wreck. But we had, people were interested, right? And they were like, I'd love to employ you, but I just don't have anything. Eventually we got to one CEO, the CEO who said kind of like, guys, I got a $20,000 project. It's a one and done, virtually no chance of any follow on. We were like, thank you. Thank you. Right. And then about 12 months later, we're running, we got $1 million run rate, right? But that was the first one. It was just literally.
So, okay.
Big.
So, and what are the core values? Do you guys have the same core values now that you had back then, or you've changed them?
No changes.
What are your core values?
So it's profit, which is interesting because it really should be discounted net cash flow, but that just doesn't roll off the tongue, right? So we said, okay, we'll use the concept of profit, right? Which gets kind of muddy, but partnership. Okay, those are the 2 P's. S for servant leadership, I for integrity, and E for excellence. And so it makes a few things, but it makes pipes, right? You can make pipes, an acronym out of it.
Okay, so servant leadership, and then 2 I's, you said?
No, 1 I, integrity.
Integrity,
and then E for excellence.
Okay.
So those were the 5 core values. Yeah, and we're still.
And I mean, those are great. Those are great core values. I mean, all of them make perfect sense. Do you feel like they've really helped you, hire people, fire people, right? Really build your culture?
I do. There's so many wonderful companies that have very similar core values. It's not like there's no secret. The only thing that's remotely unusual at the time, and probably less so now, is servant leader. That was a rare one, but the other four are pretty, very, very straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you see them a lot.
If you can live by them and lead by them, right, it becomes part of your culture, and that's the purpose of the values. If you got them and they're just on the wall, it doesn't mean a lot, right? If they're just in your brochure and a customer reads them once in a while, and your team doesn't live by them, it doesn't mean a lot, right? Okay, so when you think about your growth from that 2-person teammate, 1-page website with a list of core values back in 2003, to where you are today, 20 years later. 2024, 21 years later, let's say, how many, you got 650 teammates, and what are your annual revenues, or what are your goals or revenues? Or
we're about we're about 150-ish, 150 million or so. Yeah. And
then how do you measure success? How does your whole team measure success when you think about last year, 2023? What says we had a great year, we had an okay year? What do you measure?
Well, it's interesting. We measure, I think most people measure we come up with a forecast, which a lot of people call a plan. And then we try to make or beat the forecast. And then, if we beat it, it's great. And if we don't, it's terrible, right? Because we thought it was a plan. And I was like, no, it's a forecast. And then we're planning around the forecast, right? And if the forecast is tough, then we're saying, how can we plan to, make it better, right? And if it's, anyway, that sort of stuff, which gets into the complex, ambiguous aspects of it, as opposed to, you just throw a plan together and go do it. So there's that. But the other thing that's very true is, and me being a shareholder, is one of the differences about Pariveda is that we're an ESOP company. There's about 300 ESOPs in the U.S. where basically the employees own the company through a trust, right? And our trust owns 42% of the stock at this point. And so we do an annual appraisal. And so that's another great measure, is did the stock value go up or down? And a lot of it, a lot of it's past, but then it's like where you have a starting point, that's the past. And then it's like, what is what's the next 5-year plan? What's the profit essentially that, the discounted.
What percentage do you still own, Bruce?
27, 28, something like that. Yeah.
And then you have other partners that have the remaining 30% or so?
I'm trying to think, there are 42. Is that right? Is it 70 or 30? It's spread out. Yeah, it's spread out over maybe 20 or 30 people. Yeah, it really drops off after, after.
And as you grow your business, do you feel like you're able to incentivize, you're able to inspire your partners, those ESOP partners, to really do what, perform, because this is their future. This is their, hopefully, the big retirement that they get, right?
Well, I would say people don't generally see the ESOP that way. I think because we're not 100% owned, and we're only 20 years. We're 20 years and it's not 100% ESOP. And so I think in our experience, it's like there's some people, like people with a strong owner entrepreneurial mentality, they really appreciate that. They appreciate, man, I own shares, and it may not be a lot of shares, but there are not that many shares. It's not like one of these places where, they have this massive number of shares and they pass it out like eye candy and it's not worth very much. I mean,
right.
These shares are worth a lot of money. And,
so
most people don't necessarily feel or think that way, but we do have, we have a very strong culture of ownership, of accountability, responsibility. And so that's very much there. And so I think the stock ownership thing helps. I don't think it's the the key leverage point.
I mean, not the secret sauce, but part of the recipe.
Part of the recipe. Yeah. And the reason for the ESOP, that was one of my conditions. Like, okay, you're going to make me start a consulting company. Then one of the things I said in that meeting that I was talking about, 30 minutes ago, was we have to have an ESOP. And they were like, what's an ESOP? And I explained it to them. And I was like, why do we want an ESOP? I said, because we want this company to be around forever. I mean, if we're here to try to develop people to all this capability, that's over the course of a career. It's like 30 years. You can't flip a company in 15 years or 5 years, and do that. So it needs to be sustained. And then, okay, that's the first generation. And then you're going to have another generation. So, you got to be around for 100 years, and why not 1,000, like, or 1,400, like at the time, this Japanese construction company was the oldest company in the world. They've since dissolved it. but the Japanese government begged one of the conglomerates to save it. For a while they did, right? But eventually the congress like, man, it's just hopeless, right? And it was
Okay. So
but
when we think
anyway,
about,
so that's
yeah,
the thing, right? And so the ESOP doesn't care. The ESOP,
yeah,
the ESOP doesn't, so, oh, I need to play golf, or oh, I want to buy a yacht, or oh, my wife tells me that we need to be in Florida, or wherever, right? If you're in Texas, right? Or we need to be in the Rocky Mountains.
yeah.
Instead of all that, right? It just doesn't care.
Cool.
So it
Cool.
can go on forever. Yeah.
I want to get into a couple of questions from Chris, and then
Yeah.
kind of what learning opportunities and some golden nuggets that Chris took away. So
Yeah.
Chris, you want to jump in here and go for it?
Yeah, definitely. This is awesome, Bruce. Thank you for sharing all this with me. You have such a unique story, and I love the energy and enthusiasm you share your life story with us. This is really fun. I have so many questions, but I want to respect your time. So I'll just throw two of them at you. So you talked about, finding really good hires right out of school, like right out of university, and then just setting them up for major career success. Can you talk about how you find them, and then how you train them to to reach just amazing levels of success
Sure.
for themselves
Sure.
and for business?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's actually we've done work for other professional firms to help them set up campus recruiting, but and I hope we do more in the future. I'm not trying to keep a secret here, but as far as like identifying where to go, so we can't afford massive training like I was afforded when I went to Accenture, because we're small, and so we need to go to schools that do a pretty good job of preparing students for work in our area. And so there's that process, right? But then you get your schools, or 5 to 10 schools that we can go to that are pretty good at that. So they got kids, these young people have the basics. I call them kids because my kids are all out of college. They're all out of grad school even. I have to watch myself, right? Young people. And even that may not be politically correct, but early career, right? Early career folk. Here we go. Early career folk. And so there's that. And then it's like we enter how we interview them on campus. So I think a lot of it's stuff that other companies do, but we focus on things like, hey, how curious are they? How much are they into learning? So those are two really important things. And you're trying to decide, are they really like lifetime that, or they're just like that now? So there's that. There's a lot about character, but that, which is relatively straightforward. One of the beauties of hiring people in their coming out of school, early career, is they're not that polished at explaining discrepancies in resumes. They don't have any things like that, and you're just generally dealing with much early and more ingenue, inexperienced and innocent folk, which is a huge plus in terms of like a lot of character things. And then, as they've got their work experience, quite a few of them have had to work. They got student loans and they've had to work through school and all that. So you get some idea of their diligence and that sort of thing. And so that was that. Now, once they've agreed to come on board, there's, I'd say, a de minimis amount of training that we do, a matter of a month or so, maybe 6 weeks, compared to 3 months or more that a big firm would do. And it's always aspiration for us that someday we'd be that large and we could do that. But it's really about getting them onto the right project with the right role so that they can start learning right away. And we believe strongly in small teams. So small team, theoretically, the ideal number of small team is like 7 to 9 people, but it can be 30 people. It can be more than 9. It's pretty awkward. But when you're on a small team like that, you get a ton of exposure to the problem, to the work, and there's relatively few interconnections between other team members, and so people can spend really quality time to building relationships in that. And that's really key. If you're going to solve a complex problem, you need a small team. It's almost no other way to really solve a problem except through small teams. because if it's so easy that one person could solve it, okay, but people generally aren't going to hire an outside party to just have one person do it. Usually not. It does happen. Right? And so that's kind of it, right? It's you on the job learning.
So you're looking for lifetime learners. You got to find the right character.
Mm-hmm.
Work ethic or work experience, even if it's through the academic side of things, right? They have that work ethic you're looking for, and then they got to be the right fit. They got to be the right fit to work within your teams or small teams to really continue to learn, to get the training that they need to be successful. That's four great points that make perfect sense, Chris.
I'd add we do have a case problem so we'll have day one interviews, and then for the second round, we put them in a team, and they solve a problem as a team. And most people do fine with that. But if you've got a person that maybe slipped through, who's got some low emotional intelligence quotient, if you will, who doesn't work well in a team, that gets exposed, and then and then they kind of drop out of the process. But we do a pretty good job on that first round, and so that rarely happens. But it's a good test, and it's quite, as I like to say, orthogonal to the interview. So you put those two together.
Sure. Hey, Chris, tell me what you picked up here, Chris, as far as nuggets.
Yeah, absolutely. So help your clients solve complex, ambiguous problems. Fall in love with the problem, of course. If your parents don't like their jobs, choose a different profession. If you're
I don't know about that one.
If you're doing innovation correct, you're going to be wrong a lot. Why would you want to do something that someone has already done? We're never going to run out of problems. If you can focus on the 70% of the iceberg problems under the water, you have a very strong chance at success. And if you want a company to be around forever, make it as an ESOP company.
Well, it helps.
Yeah.
It helps, yeah. On the ownership side. It helps on the ownership side.
Yeah. Bruce, where can our audience find out more about you?
Really about Pariveda. That's www.parivedasolutions, one word, .com. There's some little, 150 word bio. I mean, it's 135 words now. I edited it the other day.
It's a great website.
On our website.
Yeah. I saw yesterday.
Yeah.
Well, hey, we really appreciate you being on today. Bruce, when we talk to technology, there's so much to gain, and there's, you don't know where things are going, but you got a better eye at than most. And it's fun to listen to your, the history of technology you shared with us today. And then the growth from a couple of friends part-time, basically, teammates to begin with in 2003 to 650 teammates today. It's pretty explosive growth over 20 years. And then to simplify your goals of solving customers' problems and actually doing it is really cool. I mean, I believe that's what makes most of us successful, when we can sincerely look out for the best interest of our customers and our teammates before ourselves. Value tends to grow. The enterprise value tends to grow in a business pretty fast if you're focused on those two things in the best way, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Well, so thanks for being on today, buddy. I really appreciate it. You know what? We look for all stars like you. We really appreciate your time with us today. We know your time is really valuable. But we're blessed to have you today, because Ditch Digger CEO is better for it, man. So thanks for being here today, and until next time, Ditch Digger CEO out.